women's hockey database called Their Hockey Counts, and I have a website with Shayna Goldman called Behind the Benches. And this is my presentation about some experiments I did this past year in women's fantasy hockey. So a little bit about me. I've been working with women's hockey data since 2015 when I first started covering the women's game. I got involved with data because there wasn't a lot out there and I wanted to use it for my work, so I just started with counting stats. And then fast forward to where I am now, I don't know how I'm here, but here we are. So a goal of mine, really since the get-go, was to get more people engaged with stats in the women's hockey community, especially because it occurred to me that data was really scarce, and I wanted more people just involved in the conversation. I want us to be evaluating players with data and talking about stats more. And it occurred to me that fantasy hockey was a really great way to do that. And right from the get-go, it was clear to me that people have really wanted fantasy hockey in the women's hockey sphere. Especially, there's a lot of noise about getting more fantasy hockey in the world of the NWHL. I should point out that others have done fantasy hockey, especially with NWHL leagues in the past. I'm not the first, and I definitely hope that I won't be the last, which is my way of saying please get inspired by this and do this yourself. And I was inspired in large part by William White's project for the Ice Garden. He did an NCAA fantasy project that was really fantastic that I used kind of as the skeleton to do my own work. So what was I trying to do? Again, as I said, I just wanted more women's hockey fans to be engaged with data, which is why I did things like sneak primary points and things like that into my fantasy project, which is me being very sneaky. I also thought this was a fun way to attract some fantasy hockey fans into the women's game, which worked out pretty well. We had some people get engaged who were very new to women's hockey, which was fun to see. And then my plan was to use both of these groups as unknowing lab rats to tinker and experiment with GameScore, as I had worked with Sean Ferris's GameScore, and this was a good reason for me to get back into it. And finally, it's fantasy hockey, so we want to have fun. Let's have fun. Let's start with what I did for the NWHL Fantasy League that I did through the Ice Garden, which was a big help. I needed one stat for fantasy points, and because I am known in our little sphere as a guy who works very hard, I chose to work smart for once. And I just subbed in GameScore for fantasy points because I knew I'd be working hard later. Little did I know how hard I'd be working, but we'll get to that in a bit. And like I said before, this was a fun opportunity to play around with GameScore, which I've really been thinking a lot, especially for goalies, because we have such basic stats, especially for goalies. So I did an experiment where I didn't penalize goalies for power play goals allowed, and that proved to be a disastrous mistake that I never want to repeat again. I also took faceoffs out of the equation from GameScore just so centers weren't too strong or too heavily influenced by faceoffs. And I was faced with the question of how do I do this? And that's really where I looked to William's model. He had a salary cap system. I made it through the Ice Garden, so everyone had 1,000 TIG bucks, and you could have 6 forwards, 4 defenders, and 2 goalies. And those are the values I had for the fantasy points based off of GameScore. So how do I value players? Really what I did is I just looked at previous season's game scores and points per games from NCAA hockey and various other professional leagues, because we have some players joining the NWHL who have played post-collegiate hockey, which kind of helps set some of those benchmarks. I know later on there's going to be a presentation about NWHLE and equivalency across women's hockey, which would have been really helpful before I did all of this. But it also helped a lot to bounce ideas off of people at the Ice Garden. It also helped to talk to Spencer Fischetta, who was doing his own fantasy project for the NWHL at She Plays, which was fantastic. I encourage you to go and look at Spencer's work there. But having all these people to talk to about values and test build teams was a big help, and that made this big project a little more digestible. The PWHPA project was a lot different. Initially, it wasn't my plan to do fantasy for the PWHPA just because the data isn't always public and it's hard to get to. But I decided at the last minute to do it because I was going to be tracking the counting stats anyway. So I kind of threw this together at the last minute. The Ice Garden wasn't involved. And it was a very stripped down version where I applied a ton of the lessons I had learned from the NWHL League, which was great because I already knew a lot of the problems I would run into, and I made things a little easier for me. Again, this was a stripped down version, but what was really fun about it is the PW had this extra point system for their scoring that really lends itself well to fantasy hockey. So shorthanded goals, hat tricks, and shutouts were worth more in the PWHPA standings, which was really fun. And so I just took that and made it part of the Fantasy Hockey League to build up the excitement around those events. And honestly, I love that idea moving forward for NWHL fantasy hockey and Women's World Championship fantasy hockey. I think that's a really fun X factor to include in all this. Again, there's a salary cap system. And what I did for the salary cap system for the PWHPA is I set a cap on the number of medals you could have on your roster for senior worlds tournaments and Olympic medals, as well as a number of cap on the players who are on Canada's centralization roster. And that was just a different way. Instead of valuing players, this was just a different way of doing it. It helped to do this at the last minute. I could just quickly look up everyone's medal count and make it so the teams were relatively level, encourage people to get familiar with different players, which is another like mini goal of mine. And it worked out pretty great. Nice team. Yeah, it's good. So how did this all go? The NWHL Fantasy League especially was a really big success. 63 teams registered. I credit a big part of that to the boost from the Ice Gardens involvement, which was way more than I expected. I expected maybe 24, so 63 was a ton. And I was immediately overwhelmed. And so I went to Alyssa and begged for help, and she thankfully automated things and made things run more smoothly. So I couldn't really have done this without her. And things were going great. It was great. People were engaged. We had great engagement on social media. We had a lot of good traffic on the Ice Garden for specifically our fantasy hockey content, which proves that people want this and it's valuable. And then COVID happened. The bubble burst in Lake Placid. The NWHL season fell apart. And I was kind of forced to make the best of a bad situation and wrap things up in a hurry. It was already expecting a short season, but it got shortened even more, but again, it was overall a very positive experience. As for the PWHPA, as I said, I did this kind of alone at the last minute. There are fewer stats to work with, but things I tracked were things like penalty minutes, primary points, especially primary assists, and goalie stats in particular, because a lot of those things just weren't in the public sphere, weren't available to the public before. It was this fast and furious version of this fantasy project, but it really came together well. We had 14 teams made, which obviously a lot smaller than the 63 teams made, but again, I should reiterate, this was just for the Canadian leg, so there's only the 3 teams. This was a much smaller thing that I did really at the last minute. Overall, it was a really good turnout for considering all those factors, and considering it didn't have the same kind of social media presence. So again, it was definitely worth the effort. Quick look at some of the MVPs, the top 15 players from both projects. If you look at the NWHL sheet, you'll notice there's a lot of goalies. And that's because I wanted to be the person who was nice to goalies and not charge them for power play goals against. And I'm sorry to say I can never be nice to goalies again because they were too valuable in fantasy hockey this way. This was really fun to do and to see which players were the most impactful in fantasy hockey. Again, this is just the counting stats. This isn't rated to average fantasy points or anything like that. And again, small samples because we have to say that with everything involved in women's hockey data, even fantasy hockey. But looking at the goalies is fun. And for the PWHPA, you notice I think Ella Shelton is the only defender in the top 15. And I think a big part of that is block shots and stuff just weren't tracked. I wasn't able to track those things. But you can also see where players got a boost from some of those extra points in that column, which is really fun. And I went through the trouble of making it so that if goalies had goalie assists, as rare as they are, they would show up in fantasy points. But the goalies in both projects didn't get any assists, which was really a massive disappointment. And I'll really never forgive them for that. So on to some lessons learned. The first lesson I learned is pandemics are bad. We shouldn't have pandemics. They ruin everything, including fantasy hockey. Again, can't recommend pandemics, not good. But this was a great way to examine game score, especially for goalies, and to kind of continue to tweak that approach for future fantasy projects. I think game score is a good way to do it until someone else maybe comes up with a different way. I know Spencer had his own method, which was really valuable. And this was just one more reminder, I think, of what we can do with public data, even really basic like boxcar stats like this. I always describe this to people who are new to stats as the things you would find on the back of a hockey card. We can do things like fantasy hockey with this. It just is a question of putting it together. But this, again, just reiterated, we really need more PWHPA data. it helps to have this out there to do things like this and to analyze players. It is so exciting to see SportLogic get involved with making some more data public, which is just fantastic. Again, it helps to have friends. It really helped to have Alyssa step in and be my hero here and make things work for the NWHL project. In case you didn't notice, Marie-Philippe Poulin's her fantasy value for the PW project was unbelievable. So, and I know she already showed up in some other earlier visualizations today where I'm not entirely sure she's human, but those are the things we've come to expect from Marie-Philippe. And yeah, this was really fun. People want women's fantasy hockey. I'm not sure it plays a huge role in growing the game in general, but this is a fun way to get people who are invested even more passionate about the game, make them more familiar with players that may not be on their favorite team, get them more invested in like paying attention to games and being like, oh, there's these little details I want to get into. And this is a fun, safe gateway drug into stats, I think, fantasy hockey is. I was contacted by actually a lot of people during this project and leading up into this presentation, people who wanted to collaborate, people who wanted to know what is out there for women's fantasy hockey, and people who wanted to partner up and do things with me in the Ice Garden for next year, all of which is really exciting. And with that, I want to say, this is my work. All of my work is public. I made sure to make the methodology public. Copy and steal my work. Build off of it. More of these things is what we want. I don't want to be the only one doing these projects. The more of these things we do, the better. We can learn so much from this. We can get fans more involved and engaged. It's really a fantastic way to just create more buzz around women's hockey. We deserve to have nice things in women's hockey, and fantasy hockey is one of those things. So that's me. I have no idea how fast I went. I'm worried that I went way too fast. I'm trying to read Alyssa's reaction as I go along here, but thank you so much. Okay, well, thank you so much for sitting through my presentation. Check out my site, Their Hockey Counts and Behind the Benches. A special thanks to my families at the Ice Garden and Blue Shirt Banner for their support in this project and all the projects I tackle. I really couldn't do it without the people in my life who encourage me. And of course, the ever helpful, wonderful crew at Hockey Graphs. They're always fantastic. I still don't know why they let me hang around, but they do, and I learn a lot. And finally, thanks for you for listening. This was really fun. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mike. I know I enjoyed that. We do have a question in chat, however, in the name of continuing to stay on schedule and the fact that I know